I still remember the first time we met. It was a sunny afternoon in April when Ethan and I crossed paths at a small cafe near the university campus. His eyes were warm, and there was something about the way he smiled that made me feel at ease, like we had known each other long before that moment. I never believed in love at first sight, but Ethan changed my mind in just a few short minutes. We started with simple conversations, then later moved on to long walks around the quiet neighborhood we both loved. From the first dates, I knew Ethan was the person I wanted to spend my life with. He was passionate about books, loved exploring new things, and had an optimistic outlook on life. Every day with him was filled with joy and a sense of peace. Our life passed by in those peaceful yet meaningful moments. Ethan often took me to explore hidden eateries in the city, and I would drag him into old bookstores, where we would lose ourselves among dusty, time-worn pages. We even went on short weekend trips, exploring new places together, but what I remember most vividly was our to Cape Cod, where Ethan proposed under a sky full of stars. I cried that night, not because I was surprised, but because I felt like my life was truly complete. We had so many dreams for the future. A small house with a garden, children with big bright eyes like Ethan's, and long, quiet afternoons together when our hair turned gray. I was certain that our love would never change, that Ethan would always be my anchor, and I would always be his safe harbor. But life is rarely as kind as our dreams. One cold winter morning, everything changed. Ethan had a terrible accident on his way home from work. His car skidded on an icy road and slammed into a tree. When I got the call from the hospital, it felt like my world was falling apart. I rushed to the hospital, praying desperately that things wouldn't be as bad as they seemed. When I arrived, Ethan was lying in the hospital bed, severely injured, but miraculously alive. I sat by his side, holding his hand through those long, agonizing hours, waiting for him to wake up. Each passing moment felt like a knife in my heart, but I believed that when he opened his eyes, he would see me, and together, we would get through this. Finally, after days of waiting, Ethan woke up. But he wasn't the Ethan I knew. When he looked at me, his eyes were unfamiliar. He didn't recognize me. He didn't remember the love we shared, the countless moments filled with laughter, or the promises we made under the stars at Cape Cod. The doctors told me that the accident had caused him to lose parts of his memory, and the most heartbreaking part was that he had no recollection of me, the woman he once loved so deeply. In the early days after Ethan woke up, I tried to convince myself that things would get better, that with time, Ethan would remember, and our love would help him heal. I spent every waking moment by his side, caring for him, telling him stories of our past. I talked about our late-night walks beneath streetlights, lazy afternoons by the beach, and all the dreams we had painted for our future. But Ethan's gaze remained distant. No matter how much I tried, he couldn't remember. He looked at me like a stranger, and it shattered my heart. Each time he furrowed his brow, struggling to recall something that wasn't there, it felt like I was losing him all over again. We lived in the same space, but the distance between us grew wider each day. I didn't want to give up. Ethan was the man I loved, the one I promised to stand by, no matter how hard things got. But with each passing day, I began to realize that love alone might not be enough to overcome this. Every time he looked at me with those unfamiliar eyes, I felt a growing sense of dread. And no matter how many stories I told him about our past, about us, about our love, all I received in return was emptiness and confusion. Life had turned Ethan into someone I didn't know. And now, I had to face the terrifying possibility that I might never get back the man I had once loved. The days turned into weeks, and each one felt heavier than the last. I found myself standing in a place where I barely recognized my own life. Ethan had been discharged from the hospital, his body healing well, but his mind, his memories, remained fragmented. He was different. Gone was the man who knew every little quirk about me, who could make me laugh with just a glance. Instead, I lived with someone who now saw me as a stranger. It wasn't that he was unkind. Ethan had always been gentle. But there was an unmistakable awkwardness between us. A layer of tension that felt like a barrier I couldn't break through. He seemed uncomfortable with how close I was, how familiar I was with details of his life that were a mystery to him now. and the more I tried to bring him back, the further he seemed to drift away. "I don't remember," he said one night, his voice barely above a whisper. We were sitting in the living room, and I had just shown him an old photo album filled with pictures of us. There was a photo from that day at Cape Cod, the one where we were laughing by the lighthouse, the ocean sparkling behind us. I want to remember, but I can't. His words were like ice. I closed the album, trying to smile, but inside, everything was unraveling. "It's okay," I said, lying to him, lying to myself. "It'll come back. We just need time." But deep down, I wasn't sure anymore. As the weeks passed, I tried everything. I took Ethan to the places we used to love. Our favorite diner, where we'd share milkshakes and fries, the park where we used to go for long walks, even the beach where he proposed. I recreated moments that had once meant everything to us, hoping that something, anything, would spark a memory. Yet, nothing worked. Ethan seemed almost distant, distracted even, as if he were just going through the motions for my sake. There were times when he'd glance at me with this strange, detached look in his eyes, and I couldn't help but wonder if he was silently resenting me. Maybe I was pushing him too hard. Maybe I was trying too hard to mold him back into the man he used to be, when all he wanted was to move forward, without the weight of the past dragging him down. Then came the day that shattered whatever hope I had left. We were sitting in that same diner, the one we used to love, and Ethan was absent-mindedly stirring his coffee. I was trying to fill the silence, talking about a funny moment we had there years ago, when he interrupted me. "Jess," he said, setting the spoon down. His voice was soft, but there was an edge to it. I think we need to stop doing this." "Stop what?" I asked, my heart tightening. "This," he gestured between us. "I can see you're trying, but I'm not that person anymore. I don't know if I'll ever be him again." I stared at him, the words piercing deeper than I could have imagined. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm. "But we were so happy. If you just—" "Jess," he cut me off again, more gently this time. "I know we were, and I'm sorry. But every time you try to make me remember, it just makes things harder for me. I don't want to hurt you, but I don't think I can be the person you need me to be." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. I blinked, my mind racing to find something, anything to say that would make him change his mind. But I realized then that this wasn't something I could fix. No matter how much I loved him, no matter how hard I tried, Ethan was slipping away from me. I took a shaky breath. "You're not hurting me," I whispered, knowing it wasn't entirely true. I don't want to give up on us." "I don't either," he said quietly. "But maybe we're holding on to something that's already gone." That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Ethan slept soundly beside me. For the first time, I realized how far apart we really were. The man who once held me close, who whispered promises of forever in my ear, now seemed like someone I barely knew. And worse, he barely knew me. In the silence of the night, the truth finally settled in. I had lost Ethan. Not to death or distance, but to time, to memory, to a cruel twist of fate that had erased all the love we had shared. And I didn't know how to fight it anymore. I had thought that love could conquer anything. But now, I wasn't so sure. The next day I made a decision. Instead of taking Ethan to more places from our past, I decided to give him space. I would stop pushing, stop trying to force the memories to return. Maybe if I stepped back, if I let him breathe, things would get better. Maybe he just needed time to come to terms with everything, and then we could rebuild, even if it wasn't the same as before. But as the days passed, I noticed a change in Ethan. He seemed lighter, less burdened by the weight of the past I had been pushing on him. He started going out more, meeting new people, doing things that were unfamiliar to me, things that didn't involve me. And then came her. The first time I saw her, I didn't think much of it. She was just a colleague of Ethan's, someone he had met while getting back into the routine of work. Her name was Hannah, and she was everything I wasn't. Bright, bubbly, and effortlessly charming. They had started working on a project together, and Ethan casually mentioned her a few times during dinner, always in the context of work. I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing. After all, Ethan and I had been through so much. There was no way a new person could change things between us. But soon, Hannah's name started to come up more often. Ethan would mention how she was helping him with this or that, how they had grabbed lunch together after a meeting. I didn't think it was anything to worry about, until the day I came home early from work and found them together. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I had taken off early, thinking I could surprise Ethan with a quiet evening together. When I walked in the door, I heard laughter coming from the living room. My heart sank as I rounded the corner and saw them sitting on the couch. Ethan's head was tilted back in laughter, and Hannah was leaning in, her hand resting lightly on his arm. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen. It wasn't that they were doing anything inappropriate, but the ease, the intimacy between them. It was something I hadn't seen in Ethan for a long time. Not with me. When Ethan noticed me standing there, his laughter faded, and he quickly moved away from her. "Jess, you're home early," he said, his voice tinged with surprise. There was no guilt, no awkwardness in his tone, but something about the scene unsettled me. "Yeah, I thought I'd surprise you," I replied, forcing a smile. My eyes flickered to Hannah, who stood up, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. She smiled warmly, oblivious to the sudden tension in the room. "I should get going," she said, grabbing her bag from the coffee table. "Thanks for the help, Ethan. I'll see you on Monday." Ethan nodded, his expression neutral, as if nothing had happened. I tried to mirror his composure, but my mind was already spiraling. When the door clicked shut behind her, the silence that followed was deafening. Later that night, I couldn't shake the image of them together from my mind. Ethan and I sat in the same room, but the distance between us felt immeasurable. He was quiet, lost in thought, while I lay next to him, wide awake. My heart was pounding, my mind racing. I wanted to ask him if there was something more between them, but the words caught in my throat. I was afraid of what I might hear if I asked. The next few days, I watched Ethan more closely. He didn't mention Hannah as much anymore, but something had shifted. There was a lightness in his demeanor that hadn't been there for months. He smiled more, laughed more, but not with me. There was a sense of freedom in him, like he was no longer weighed down by the memories we had shared. And that terrified me. Then, one evening, as we sat across from each other at dinner, the conversation took a turn I had been dreading. "Jess," Ethan began, his voice cautious, as if he knew what he was about to say would hurt. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately." I set down my fork, my heart already racing. "About what?" "About us." He paused, running a hand through his hair, a gesture I knew all too well, a sign that he was nervous. "I don't want to hurt you, but I don't know if we're working anymore." The words hung in the air like a punch to the gut. I stared at him, my chest tightening. "What are you saying, Ethan?" "I think." He hesitated, his eyes meeting mine for the briefest moment before looking away. "I think maybe it's time for us to take a break, to figure things out." I felt like the floor was crumbling beneath me. A break? After everything we had been through, after all the effort I had put into helping him recover, he wanted to walk away? My voice cracked when I spoke. "Is this because of her? Because of Hannah?" Ethan looked genuinely surprised, his brow furrowing. "No, Jess, it's not about Hannah. It's about us. Things have been different, and I don't want to keep pretending everything is okay when it's not." I wanted to scream, to tell him that it wasn't okay because he wasn't trying hard enough, that if he just remembered what we had, everything would be fine. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Ethan had changed. And maybe I had too. The next few weeks were unbearable. Ethan moved out, saying he needed space to clear his head. Our apartment, once filled with laughter and love, felt hollow without him. I spent hours staring at old photos, replaying memories of us in my mind, trying to hold on to any scrap of hope that things could still work out. But with each passing day, that hope grew dimmer. I couldn't stop thinking about Hannah. I hated myself for it. But every time Ethan didn't answer my calls or replied late to my texts, I imagined him with her. I pictured them laughing, sharing the easy connection that had once been ours. The thought of it consumed me, gnawing at my insides like a slow, painful poison. One evening, in a moment of weakness, I drove by her apartment. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was just torturing myself with baseless suspicions. But when I saw Ethan's car parked outside, my heart shattered. I sat in my car, staring at the undeniable truth in front of me, tears streaming down my face. He had moved on. and I was still standing in the ruins of what we used to be, holding on to a love that no longer existed. That night, something inside me broke. I realized that no matter how much I loved Ethan, no matter how hard I fought for us, he was no longer the same man I had fallen in love with. And I could no longer be the woman who waited for him to come back to me. As I lay in bed, the weight of reality settling over me like a heavy blanket, I whispered to the empty room, "I have to let go." Letting go wasn't easy. It wasn't something that happened in a single moment, like the movies would have you believe. It was an agonizing process, a slow unraveling of everything I had once believed in, everything I had once hoped for. Ethan was gone from my life, but his presence still haunted every corner of my existence. At first, I clung to the memories. I held them close, afraid that if I let go of the past, I would lose him entirely. Every time I passed by the cafe where we met, I could almost see us there. Our first conversation, his smile, the spark that had ignited everything between us. Our favorite places became landmines, detonating emotions that sent me spiraling into grief all over again. I tried to keep myself busy, throwing myself into work, spending time with friends, anything to fill the silence. But no matter how hard I tried to distract myself, the ache in my chest remained. It felt like a part of me had been ripped away, leaving behind a hollow space that nothing seemed able to fill. The worst moments came at night. Alone in our empty apartment where every corner held a memory of Ethan, I found myself staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment we had shared. I thought about the way he used to hold me, the way we used to dream together about our future. It felt like a lifetime ago. Now, all of those dreams had crumbled to dust. I wanted to be angry at him. I wanted to blame him for leaving, for moving on so easily. But every time I tried to summon that anger, it dissolved into sadness. Because the truth was, Ethan hadn't done anything wrong. He had changed, through no fault of his own. And so had I. We were no longer the same people who had fallen in love all those years ago. A few weeks after Ethan moved out, I ran into him by chance. It was a warm spring afternoon, and I had just left a bookstore, one of the few places that still gave me a sense of peace. As I stepped out onto the sidewalk, I saw him walking toward me, hand in hand with Hannah. The sight of them together sent a jolt of pain through me, but I forced myself to smile. I had told myself that I was ready to move on, that I had accepted the fact that Ethan was no longer mine. But standing there, face to face with the reality of it, was harder than I had imagined. "Jess," Ethan said, his voice gentle, cautious. "How have you been?" I wanted to say I was fine, that I had been doing great, that I was moving on just like he had. But the truth was still too raw. I'm getting by," I replied, my voice barely steady. Hannah smiled politely, her arm still linked through Ethan's. She looked so at ease with him, so comfortable, as if they had been together for years. I wondered if she knew the story behind us, if she knew how deeply I had loved him. "We were just on our way to grab lunch," Ethan said, gesturing toward a cafe across the street, the same one where we had shared so many memories. The irony wasn't lost on me. "Maybe we could catch up sometime?" I nodded, but I knew we wouldn't. Not really. There was nothing left to say, no way to bridge the chasm that had formed between us. Yeah, maybe. As they walked away, I watched them for a moment, my heart heavy. They looked happy together, and as much as it hurt to admit it, I knew that I had to let them go, let him go. After that day, I started making real changes. I couldn't keep living in the shadow of what once was. So I packed up the apartment. Every room felt like it was drowning in memories of Ethan, and I realized that staying there was only holding me back. I needed a fresh start, somewhere that wasn't haunted by our past. I moved into a smaller place across town. It was cozy, a little rough around the edges, but it was mine. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. There were no ghosts of Ethan here, no reminders of the life we had once shared. It was just me, standing on my own 2 feet, ready to rebuild myself. The first few days in the new apartment were strange. The silence was overwhelming at times, but it also felt like a clean slate. I started filling the space with things that brought me joy. New books, plants, art I had never had room for before. I threw myself into hobbies I had neglected during the years I had been with Ethan. I painted, I wrote, I spent hours at the park just watching the world go by. Slowly, the heaviness began to lift. It wasn't that I stopped missing Ethan, because a part of me always would. But I started to realize that I wasn't defined by him, or by the relationship we had once shared. I was my own person, with my own dreams, my own passions. And for the first time in a long time, I started to feel a sense of hope for the future. One afternoon, a few months after the move, I found myself back at the beach where Ethan had proposed. It was quiet, the sun setting over the water, casting everything in a warm, golden light. I hadn't been back there since that night, when everything had seemed so perfect, so full of promise. As I stood there, the waves lapping at my feet, I realized that I was finally ready to let go. Not just of Ethan, but of the life we had dreamed of together. Those dreams had been beautiful, but they weren't meant to be. And that was okay. I closed my eyes, feeling the ocean breeze against my skin, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. The pain was still there, but it wasn't as sharp. It had softened, become a part of me, but not the whole of me. I had survived the worst of it. I had learned how to stand on my own again, and I knew, in that moment, that I was going to be okay. A year had passed since I let go of Ethan. The days had turned into months, and slowly, life had begun to take on a new rhythm. I had found peace in my little apartment, in the small routines that filled my days. The ache in my chest was no longer the unbearable weight it once was, but a soft, distant memory. A reminder of the love I had shared, but also of the strength I had found in losing it. I had started to build a new life for myself. I threw myself into my work, took on new projects, and even started volunteering at a local animal shelter, a small dream I had always pushed aside when I was with Ethan. It was there, surrounded by the wagging tails and hopeful eyes of the dogs, that I found a sense of purpose again. One day, while I was at the shelter, a young woman came in with a stray she had found wandering the streets. The dog was skittish, scared, and clearly in need of care. As I approached him, crouching down to his level, I felt an odd connection with the creature, like we were both a little lost, but trying to find our way. "Hey, buddy," I whispered, extending my hand gently. The dog hesitated, but eventually came closer, sniffing my hand cautiously before nudging it with his nose. His dark eyes were full of fear, but also trust. It was in that moment that I realized I wasn't just healing from the loss of Ethan. I was learning to open my heart again, even if it was in small ways. I decided to adopt him. A few weeks after bringing Max home, my life had taken on a new kind of happiness. He was my constant companion, always at my side with his wagging tail and playful energy. He gave me a reason to get up every morning to explore the world outside my little apartment. We spent hours walking through the park, finding new trails, and just soaking in the simplicity of life. One Saturday morning, while walking Max near the farmer's market, I bumped into someone familiar, someone I hadn't seen in months. "Jess?" The voice was tentative, unsure, but unmistakable. I turned around, and there was Ethan, standing a few feet away, looking almost exactly the same as I remembered. His eyes, though, were softer, gentler, as if the year apart had changed him too. "Ethan," I said, feeling a strange mix of emotions, surprise, nostalgia, but not the sharp pain I once felt at the sight of him. There was a pause as we both took in the moment, a long silence that hung between us. "You look good," he said, his smile small but genuine. "Really good." "Thanks," I replied, glancing down at Max, who was wagging his tail, oblivious to the emotional weight of the moment. "This is Max." Ethan knelt down to greet the dog, and for a brief second it felt like old times, like we were just two people who had once shared a life together. But as he stood up, I realized how much had changed between us. "How have you been?" he asked, his voice careful, as if he wasn't sure if it was okay to ask. "I've been good," I answered honestly. "It took some time, but I'm happy now." Ethan nodded, and I could see a sense of relief wash over him. "I'm really glad to hear that, Jess. I've thought about you a lot, wondering how you were doing." I smiled, appreciating his sincerity. "What about you? How's everything been?" He hesitated for a moment before answering. "It's been good. I've been doing a lot of thinking, trying to figure things out." His gaze dropped for a second, then he looked back at me. "Hannah and I were not together anymore. It didn't work out." I didn't know how to respond to that. The part of me that once would have wanted to hear those words, would have taken some twisted satisfaction in them, was gone. Instead, I just felt a quiet understanding. Things don't always work out the way we plan, and that was okay. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it. We stood there for a moment longer, just two people who had shared a past, but were no longer tethered to it. I realized then that I wasn't waiting for some grand reconciliation. I didn't need him to come back to me. We were different people now, and our paths had diverged. "Maybe we could catch up sometime?" Ethan suggested, his voice hopeful but not insistent. I thought about it for a moment. "Yeah, maybe," I said, echoing the words I had spoken all those months ago. But this time, I meant it differently. There was no lingering pain, no unresolved tension. If we crossed paths again, it would be as friends, nothing more. After that encounter, I didn't think much about Ethan. He had been a part of my life, a chapter that had shaped me, but it was a chapter that had ended. I had learned to love him, and I had learned to let him go. And in doing so, I had learned to love myself again. Max and I continued to explore the world together, finding joy in the little things. A warm cup of coffee, a new trail to hike, the laughter of friends. I made new memories, new connections, and slowly I built a life that was mine. Completely mine. One evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the sunset, Max curled up at my feet. I realized how far I had come. The pain of losing Ethan had once felt unbearable. But now, it was just a small part of my story. A story that had so much more to tell. Love is a complicated thing. It can lift you up, make you feel like you're soaring, and it can tear you apart, leaving you shattered on the ground. But what I learned is that even in the pain, there is growth. Even in the loss, there is something to be found. And sometimes letting go isn't the end, it's the beginning of something new.